From the day Pierre and I arrived in Moscow, I was showered with presents. The foreign minister's wife produced an interlocking set of Russian dolls and lacquered boxes. She gave me boxes and pins and ornaments, and then came the day for our return present giving. I had been counting the hours until I could return some of their generosity. I asked the External Affairs Secretary to send over my present so that I could wrap it beautifully before presenting it. To my consternation and total disbelief, there appeared a meager plate silver maple leaf, costing probably no more than $35. "But this," I moaned to Pierre, "is what I ought to give Tanya, my interpreter, not the Prime Minister's daughter." Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise. And today we're going to keep going in Margaret Trudeau's memoir, Beyond Reason. The last time that we talked, we were talking about their home life and how it was really hard for her because she sort of felt like she was being relegated to this world of motherhood while Pierre went and did his thing. She was not invited into his world as prime minister. He had made it very clear that he wanted his life with her to be his life with her, and that he didn't want her getting involved in politics and getting too close to that world. So that meant that when he was working and things like that, she was not invited to interrupt him in any way. He had a lot of things he was doing. I don't know if his decision to leave her outside of his political world was to preserve her, or if he just thought that she would have too many missteps if she entered that world. Regardless, he made it very clear that there was a boundary there. But because of that, she felt like she was forced into a world that she didn't know how to handle. She didn't know how to handle taking charge of all of these servants. She didn't grow up in a home, obviously, that had servants. She had never been trained on how to run a household full of these older people who've been running the show fine all this time. And then, she comes in and she's supposed to tell everybody what to do. And then, just with, all the wardrobe changes that she had to have and all of the outfits that she had to have and always feeling like possibly she was putting a foot wrong in that arena. And then, of course, there's all the protocol, all the things you're supposed to know how to do, all the things you're supposed to remember to do, which is something that this chapter today is really going to focus on, her battle with protocol. But one of the things I found a little bit difficult to reconcile is the fact that as she's writing this book, she's looking back in retrospect and saying, I was only 22. What did anybody expect? How was I supposed to do this? And then she goes on to tell story after story after story about how she totally slayed this situation. About how, something arose and then I just took the bull by the horns and I settled that one. So it feels like she's using her age as an excuse to any of the critique that she has received. Like, well, what do you think a 22-year-old would do? But she clearly felt very sure of herself at the time. And in the writing of the book, even though out of one side of her mouth she says I was only 22, then she proceeds to tell us about how, well, I came in there and I told them what to do and I changed that and I fixed this. And if it hadn't been for me, who knows where they'd be. So I don't even know how much she believes that she was incapable as a 22-year-old. Certainly her actions at the time don't reflect that she felt unsure of herself at all. And it feels a little bit like a cop-out now. But we're going to continue with this chapter. Again, it's all about her battle with protocol. And it's more of the same, honestly. More of, what did you expect of me? But let me give you all of these examples of how I just absolutely killed it and no one's giving me any credit. All right. The chapter begins by saying that there was no escaping official life. It was there all the time, lurking. It emerged in frenetic bursts of entertaining and dressing up, catching planes to new places and talking to strangers through interpreters, only to be switched off again just as suddenly, leaving me washed up in my privacy and peace. It wasn't long before my childhood habit to be secretive, to split myself into separate, isolated parts, each carefully locked away from the other, began again with a vengeance. Already a side note, but you guys, that's startling behavior. And I'm no psychologist, obviously. But I think that it is really interesting that she, as a child, had already developed a habit of having two personalities, dependent on what she thought was necessary. Now, of course, we all have different sides to who we are, who we present at different times, because that's the appropriate thing. So I don't know if this is really to the point of it's like being a psychological break, although she was hospitalized for a psychotic break. So I think we can assume this is more serious than just Well, I act like this sometimes in social settings, and then when I'm at home, I let my hair down. I don't think it's quite as innocent as that. But anyway, she says, I became two different people. In the background at 24 Sussex and up at the lake, I was Mrs. Trudeau, an ordinary suburban Canadian housewife who liked to bake bread and cross-country ski. The moment officialdom struck, I was transformed into the wife of the Prime Minister. It was all rather like Cinderella and her pumpkin. And how does a 22-year-old girl with no experience of protocol, formality, or procedure learn the rules? One thing was clear. I had to learn them, and I had to learn them fast. Protocol will protect you, Mrs. Michener, my mentor, kept repeating. If you do that right, you won't have to put yourself on the line. You'll be judged by your manners. I believed every word. The problem was how to absorb it all. By keeping his staff away from me and not thinking to provide me with an assistant or even an experienced social secretary who could have guided me along, Pierre effectively kept me in the dark far longer than I need have been. He meant it kindly, but it was a mistake. To which I say, didn't she just tell us in the last episode that she had an assistant? Remember, because she'd lay up in the bed until like 9 o'clock in the morning. And then when her Puritanism kicked in, she would get out of bed. And then she'd go downstairs and she'd have a leisurely breakfast. And then she would call her assistant. And they would talk for ages. And then she'd get on about her day. So was that just like a later iteration of her life? But that she had been without an assistant for a long time? Because she says in that chapter she got an assistant because she started getting so much personal mail. She needed somebody to help her answer it. And then, she had this assistant, but it was kind of part-time because the person split their time between her and somebody else. So it's just a little clarity on that would have been helpful from her. Anyway, she says, I learned the hard way by watching and listening to the other wives when they came to visit us, or I went to them, and imitating those whom I judged masters of the art. Everywhere I went, I kept muttering rules and advice to myself. Remember to offer Mrs. So-and-so orange juice because she doesn't drink alcohol. Remember to carry the carnation sent by the principal's wife when you visit the school. Talk to General X about sailing. Don't mention religion to Mrs. Y. And so it went on. To my astonishment, it soon dawned on me that I wasn't alone in my revulsion against the tedium of official life. Almost everyone seemed to loathe it, and some were driven nearly insane by it. And this realization, in a sense, was to prove my downfall, for I now set out, single-handed, to change it all. I had a mission, a crusade. I was going to make official life fun. She has this hubris that is, I feel like, ultimately her downfall, because why would you think that you, as a 22-year-old, single-handedly could show up on the scene of, ancient rituals and be like, well, this is boring, and I know you all think so let's get down. I mean, it's not the plot of a movie. That's the plot of a movie, to think that you at 22 could show up and, give everyone the good time that they're longing for. But see, everybody else has too much at stake to throw down with you at a party. You are only 22 and showed up in the scene and have nothing. You have no stake in government. You've nothing on the line except for your husband's reputation, which of course you should take care of. But all these other people, as much as they might want to, throw their hair down and actually have some good times, aren't going to do it because that hasn't been shown to be successful. And they're not about to put everything on the line just for the dalliance of a good time. All right, so she goes on to say that Pierre had told me on several occasions that he believed that Canada, as a peaceful neutral nation, should do its best to have an effect on international relations and in bringing opposing countries together. Fine, I said. For that we must have sincerity, not stuffy protocol. Couldn't we start by putting a bomb under all our chiefs of protocol, as the Leica Siamese twins, whether in Peking, London, or Belgrade? Blow up that separate culture called protocol? No, said Pierre, we couldn't. So I chose my own way to beat the system. I decided to master it to perfection, so that there was no wife better than I at the details and the niceties, the small talk and the correct titles. Then, and only then, properly briefed, immaculately dressed, and at ease wherever I went, would I emerge from behind the protective coloring and be a real honest person. I kept repeating to myself the words that Mrs. Michener and then Prince Philip had both said to me. It is your duty. It's a vocation. Get it perfect. There was a lot to learn first, and I tackled the job with a mixture of impatience and dedication, getting into trouble more times than I cared to remember. My first official visit as Pierre's wife to Russia 2 months after we married had left a scar on my soul, and it was to that I returned in my thoughts when deciding what to tackle next. First, there was the issue of presents. From the day Pierre and I arrived in Moscow, I was showered with presents. One day, Mr. Kosijin gave me a magnificent amber necklace. The next, the government presented me with a bone china tea set. Then, the foreign minister's wife produced an interlocking set of Russian dolls and lacquered boxes. She gave me boxes and pins and ornaments, and then came the day for our return present giving. I had been counting the hours until I could return some of their generosity. I asked the External Affairs Secretary to send over my present, so that I could wrap it beautifully before presenting it. To my consternation and total disbelief, there appeared a meager plate silver maple leaf, costing probably no more than $35. "But this," I moaned to Pierre, "is what I ought to give Tanya, my interpreter, not the Prime Minister's daughter." Mrs. Teresa Ford, our ambassador's wife, overheard my squeaks of outrage. She hurried over and offered me the gold maple leaf encrusted with emeralds that the Governor-General's wife had lately presented her with. It was an incredibly generous gesture, and I was very touched. But I refused to approach and got around my dilemma by telling the Prime Minister's daughter that by some oversight in the packing, her present had got left behind. The day I returned to Ottawa, I went to our best furriers and bought a Mackenzie mink stole. It was sent off in the diplomatic pouch to Moscow. That, I thought, was a more suitable present of thanks for all the warmth and hospitality. Let me just say this. While I do think that the mink coat was definitely a generous gesture, and of course seems to have been much more equal to the gifts that she received while she was on that visit, I wonder if it wouldn't have been better just to take the gold maple leaf with the emeralds rather than tell this person a lie about, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it looks like your present was forgotten." And of course she did more than make up for it later with the mink coat, but that sounds like such an obvious excuse. That's like, "Oh, I'm sorry you didn't get the invitation. Must have gotten lost in the mail. Oh, your present's coming. Sorry, Amazon's not, bringing it as fast as I thought they were. Something must have come up." You know how things happen. It's such an obvious excuse. I don't know. I think I would rather have had something to give her in that moment. But I suppose everything worked out. Anyway, she goes on to talk about how the gifts that were being offered in these diplomatic situations were ridiculously terrible, and that thank God they had her around so she could sort this mess out. The truth is that a lot of the things that she points out, I can see the problems, and maybe they really did take a young eye. But I think the thing that is upsetting to me, I mean, not upsetting, I don't have like an official stake in this or anything, but I think the thing that sort of gets on my nerves is just her shock that everyone is so lame, and then it's like she gets to be the hero of the day. And there's just no graciousness to why it could have been a certain way before she got there. Anyway, she goes on to say that I asked External Affairs for their policy over official gifts. None, it transpired. A few months before I married Pierre, a woman civil servant had simply been asked to stock a cupboard in the ministry with all the presents that she could think of that might do for an official visit. And the result was a pile of worthless rubbish, greatly inferior to almost every item that I had thrown out of our junk room. It had led to some scandalous mistakes. On a recent official visit to London, the Canadian presents had all been blankets. It's not a bad idea. But when the day for presentation arrived, it was discovered from the labels that they had all been made in Birmingham. From that day on, I made presents my business. First, I used to try to learn something about the people we were giving presents to. Were they young, frivolous, interested in crafts, books? Then I inquired about good Canadian artists and craftsmen and went to visit their studios. I didn't feel the gifts had to be expensive as long as they were suitable and reflected Pierre's personal taste rather than government charity. My searches took me to the government warehouse, which handles all Eskimo and Indian art on its way into the galleries and shops, and this proved an invaluable source for my better presents. There were always so many to plan, up to 12 on any major foreign visit, ranging from something of obvious value for the Prime Minister's wife to something modest but distinctive for an interpreter. The presents were, of course, a two-way business. In the United States, all official presents belong to the state. In Canada, they belong to the recipients. I soon found myself showered with things of immense value and beauty. Just after we were married, the governor of Newfoundland offered me an otter coat, and the commissioner of the Northwest Territories a Mackenzie mink. Pierre made me refuse them, saying they were too costly. But there was little he could do about the sunburst gold Andrew Grimma brooch, covered in diamonds, given me by the Queen. nor the Inca pink clay adobe with tiny carved figures given me by Mrs. Perez, nor the 4 crates of Japanese tableware, nor Mrs. Gandhi's silk saris, nor Mrs. Nixon Bartlett's print, nor the marble jewelry box. 24 Sussex was filled to bursting with the tea sets, boxes, and lacquered trays, though Pierre put his foot down on a sealskin kayak and presented it to the Museum of Man. My attitude to the presents didn't always make me popular. When I met Mrs. Perez, I was so charmed by her that impulsively I unpinned a carved gold killer whale brooch engraved by Bill Reed from my own dress and pinned it onto hers. The trouble was that I had been presented with it by the Aquarium of Vancouver when I opened their new section, and not long after my return to Ottawa I was asked to lend it for an exhibition of Haida Indian art. I discovered very early on that it was impossible to match the hospitality and generosity that Pierre and I were shown on official visits. The smaller and poorer countries in particular gave the most lavish and expensive of gifts, almost, it seemed, as a form of bribery. Well, I don't know if it's a form of bribery, is it? Don't you often find that people who have fewer means are often more generous than those who have a lot? Anyway, she says that I felt the irony of it keenly, especially when Sheikh Mujib Rahman, the president of Bangladesh, came to Canada in what was principally a search for aid, and brought with him an entire trunk of silks and an exquisite necklace of seed pearls. Maybe they were bribes, but isn't any gift that's given to somebody else in a political capacity a little bit of a bribe? I mean, maybe not an overt one. You are just trying to create diplomacy, and maybe that's not a bribe. Maybe that's exactly what it is. It's diplomacy. It's kindness from one person to another. But if you think that people are giving you these expensive gifts just out of the generosity of their heart, it's not that. They need you to like them. And so I don't know if all the gifts were given with altruism as the highest order. Anyway, we have to get on. I can't microanalyze every single thing she says. The gifts under control, I now turned to the more awkward question of briefing. Having been humiliated in Russia by the full depth of my ignorance of everything from simple geography to the identity of the people to whom I was introduced, I begged Pierre to make certain I had written notes in good time before a visit. In the early days, this would merely consist of another copy of the collection of notes that went out to the press. Later on, after I had seen how thorough and elaborate the American briefing books are, with photographs of all the people you're likely to meet, and a brief resume of their tastes, I became more demanding. Sometimes I even got my hands on Pierre's notes, which were far more amusing. "Perhaps you should not get too heavily involved with X," they would read, "because, having evaded tax for 6 years, he's about to be impeached." Gradually, I started to exercise some control over my program, mixing obligations I could not get out of with visits to places that genuinely interested me. In Japan, I accepted a morning's flower arrangement, but then I also made sure that I paid a visit to the Nikon factory to see how the cameras are made. I discovered that I was free to choose, and that if I ever suggested anything, my host seemed only too delighted to lay it on. It was also one positive way of escaping the interminable cups of tea with the dreary diplomats' wives, trying hard to look pretty and think up inanities to say to one another. Of all the official visits I paid, the one to France in the autumn of 1974 was the most difficult and the most redolent of protocol. It wasn't made easier by the fact that I wasn't long out of the hospital, following serious emotional stress. I looked that up, you guys. She was in the hospital for like a psychological break. And having just told us that she had a secretive way of having separate personalities for separate events, I am not surprised that she's having severe emotional distress. She says by then the contradictions of my life were really beginning to tell on me. There's no doubt that the French can be the rudest, most arrogant people in the world. This was our first state visit to France since de Gaulle had made his Free Quebec statement in Montreal during Expo 67. And so effectively cut off relations between France and Canada for almost a decade. We simply had to do well. It wasn't going to be easy. We had to open the door of good relations again, yet at the same time assert that France could not treat Quebec as a separate independent country. My first function without Pierre, he was at an official men-only lunch, was a reception given by Madame Chirac, the Prime Minister's wife, a chic woman with a sharp nose. The food was superb. The guests were all women, the wives of cabinet ministers, diplomats, and members of parliament, and oh boy, did they condescend to me. I was the youngest by 25 years, and they made me feel like a stupid, ill-informed, clumsy, illiterate child. Outwardly, all was civility and good breeding. Inside, I was seething. I had Marie-Helene Fox with me, Pierre's political secretary, a professional career girl. The conversation soon came round to how very selfish career women are, and how very arrogant it is of them not to marry and have children. I did my best to support Marie-Helene, but with lamentable French, and, as a wife raising her children, being in a weak position myself, there wasn't much I could do. The hostility oozing out of these French women toward me grew more intense as the days went by. I had one afternoon off, and savoring every minute of it, I decided to go to a fashion show. It was at the time when Saint Laurent was changing his neat, tailored look and presenting wild Russian peasant costumes in his collection. I was eager to see them. Madame Chirac, on hearing my plans, pressed me to go to the haute couture fashion parade by a more conservative designer. I protested. No, I really want to see Saint Laurent. They demurred. Finally, with sighs and considerable bad grace, Madame Chirac insisted on accompanying me to Saint Laurent. Behind us during the show sat an entire row of Paris Match reporters listening to our conversation and chattering gaily among themselves. I longed to join them. Instead, here I was, trapped, condemned by association, blushing with embarrassment, when Madame Chirac kept up a long tirade in a clear, caring voice about how appalling the clothes were. I was barely polite. In the end, I was as rude as she was. Clothes were so immensely important. If I felt correctly dressed, it gave me the initial boost in confidence that enabled me to cope. If my shoes were even slightly scuffed, I felt distracted and self-conscious. I had begged to be able to take a maid to France with me, but my request had been turned down as pretentious. On the night of our grandest dinner during the tour, held at the Élysée, I had a pink silk organdy Valentino dress with painted peonies to wear. It was a very low-cut dress, which I kept for only the grandest occasions. To show it off at its best, I decided to have my hair done by Alexandre, who opened his salon especially for me. His makeup man took 3/4 of an hour on my mouth alone. I came out radiant. My hair cut severely across in bangs, the, quote, Mandarin look, white and black and impassive. But it was not the hairstyle nor the face to go with a fluffy pink décolleté dress, as I soon discovered back before my own mirror. I scrubbed most of the lipstick off my mouth, but had no time left to do much about the eyes, which had almost totally disappeared under more layers of greens and grays than even Elizabeth Taylor puts on. In despair, I realized that I would have to abandon the fluff for something far plainer, something stark. I settled on a white silk shirt and a long black evening skirt. No sooner had I stepped inside the palace than I saw my terrible error. There was not a woman present who was not wearing haute couture. Alone, I looked out of place. The formal dinner started in agony. If anything, it got worse. I sat next to the president, who, with a slightly flirtatious manner that always reminded me of Pierre, did his best to put me at ease. On my other side was Prime Minister Chirac, a heavy, somber figure like a successful French lawyer or a big American Midwesterner. At least I thought, if all else is a disaster, the conversation will be memorable. And indeed it was. All the president wanted to talk about was hippies, as if I were a rather curious specimen from the subculture. Tell me about marijuana. What do you young people really feel about drugs? I was somewhat taken aback, but then thought perhaps he really does want to know, and opened my mouth to reply. And before I could speak, Monsieur Chirac waded in. Talking about marijuana, he said ponderously, we had that problem in my family. One of my nephews started smoking it. I felt indignation rising inside me at the sound of his authoritative, self-righteous tone. We just made it perfectly clear to him that if he carried on with it, he would be disowned, his family fortune taken away, and he would never be allowed in the house again. I looked at him aghast. Has he ever smoked marijuana again? Certainly not, replied Chirac, both surprised and indignant, as if the boy could not conceivably have made any other choice. My worst guffaw in France happened on the day that the president's wife took me to the Louvre. I was with a crowd of French ladies, and we passed in front of what seemed to me to be every single picture in the building, pausing for a few seconds while the ladies kept their eyes riveted upon me to check my reaction. My French was still atrocious, adequate accent but horrendous grammar, and I felt that they were testing me. I took a cowardly, if unpremeditated, way out. I passed out cold on the floor. The dear wife of the French ambassador to Canada threw herself forward to break my fall, but I collapsed all the same in a heap on the stone floor. I now believe entirely under the pressure of feeling myself on the defensive and sneered at. Fainting was an unconscious escape I often took on formal occasions, particularly when very nervous or pregnant. When the Queen spoke in Charlottetown and was halfway through her address, I disappeared into my chair on the podium. On another occasion, I was sitting next to Mr. Michener and across the table from President Tito during our state visit to Canada toward the end of a seemingly week-long meal of interpreters, cigars, and goodwill. Just as Mr. Michener rose to his feet to offer the official welcome toast, I had to stumble out of the room before fainting. We stayed in Paris 4 days and then went on to Belgium, where the NATO summit on nuclear de-escalation was to take place. These were tricky, intense talks for Pierre, who was trying to formulate a special relationship between Canada and the EEC, while hinting that we were also considering a series of defense cuts. I did my best to keep my deep sense of unease from him. It was in Brussels that I got my first real inkling of my social rank in terms of world protocol. One night, while One night at a working dinner for the NATO heads, Queen Fabiola gave a dinner for the wives and then took us on to a concert. At the dinner, I found myself on her left because though many of the wives, like Frau Helmut Schmidt and Mrs. Harold Wilson, were senior to me in age, my husband had served longer as Prime Minister. On Queen Fabiola's other side sat Mrs. Gerald Ford. I learned that Mrs. Ford and the French president's wife ranked the same, so that had she been there, the president's wife would have had my place. The dinner was held at the Queen's Palace, and the food was, if possible, even more delicious than that at the Élysée. It was a full dress affair with tiaras and decorations. This time I was dressed correctly in my Valentino pink dress and felt in control, all the more so as I had noticed that I was not the only wife who blundered. At a lunch given by Mrs. Luns, the wife of the head of NATO, the wives were asked to assemble by 12:45 p.m. All were there at the appointed time, except for Mrs. Ford. We drank one glass of sherry, and then another, and then a third, and still no Mrs. Ford. At 1:15 she strolled casually through the door without the hint of an apology, saying that she had been at the hairdresser. By then a definite sense of school-girlish camaraderie had grown among the rest of us, particularly after Mrs. Luns had somewhat maliciously regaled us with stories about how early that morning the American Secret Service had arrived to ask if they could stand in the kitchens. They wanted to watch while the meal was prepared, to be certain no poison crept into the meal. Mrs. Luns refused. At its best, the dressing up was like some magical fantasy world, a reward for all the boredom and stuffiness of the long social occasions. I knew I could make myself look lovely, and that if I did throw myself into the part, I could quite easily be transformed from a jeans and sneakers girl into a sophisticated woman. With the pomp and the grandeur of these evenings, I sometimes pretended I was in a fairy tale. It was made more romantic by the fact that each time Pierre put on his black tie and tails, I fell in love with him all over again. I don't know what it is about him dressed up, but we made the most of the romance. We were on show, the flower child who married a prime minister, and we acted the part. Before we go on, is anybody else like, what the heck with this fainting business? I've never. But then again, I've never been in a situation where I felt so colossally judged by a whole group of people who I now have the privilege of hanging around with, and everybody in the room is older than me, and everybody's waiting for me to mess up, and they can't wait for me to mess up. I mean, honestly, probably I would be falling out fainting. Because as a person who unfortunately cares way too much about what other people think and wanting to please other people, a scenario in which I could not win would have made me feel incredibly anxious, and who knows how I would physically react. Sometimes I can't even read correctly because I know I'm going to mispronounce a name, and I'm like, oh gosh, I'm going to hear about it in the comments, and everyone's going to say, you know it's really pronounced like this. And the amount of times I stumble reading, and then the editing is a nightmare because I'm afraid of mispronouncing a word, is unbelievable. It's the worst. So if I can't even read correctly for fear of a bunch of people who I'll never meet, maybe I would have fallen to the floor in a dead faint. Unfortunately, probably. Okay, we're going to go on. She says, possibly the most successful and certainly the most unusual trip we made was to China in the autumn of 1973, a getting-to-know-you visit of the old-fashioned sort, made more important by the fact that we were the first Western nation to visit China officially. I was 7.5 months pregnant with Sasha. I went to my doctor for my monthly visit in October, bewailing the fact that I was going to have to miss this trip. I was astonished to hear him say, why ever don't you go? There's absolutely no reason not to. All he insisted was that I take along someone to help, which was a godsend, for it set a precedent, and in the future, especially when ill or pregnant, I was allowed a companion. I chose Joyce Fairburn, Pierre's parliamentary assistant, and was especially pleased when Pierre chose one of his British Columbian MPs, Len Marchand, and his wife Donna to accompany us. As it turned out, I couldn't have been looked after better. One of the men on our plane, the deputy minister from the Department of Health and Welfare, Maurice Leclerc, was a doctor himself, and the Chinese were so anxious that all would go well that they had a doctor waiting at the airport who wanted to rush me off and examine me the moment the plane touched the ground. The weather was perfect, warm by day and cool at night, which was just as well since I had had very little time to prepare suitable clothes for the trip, and was in any case a very awkward shape. I was amazed by the beauty of the city and the way that the capital of the most populated country in the world still looks like a sprawling country town, with single-store buildings made of sticks, clay, and bamboo poles. Everywhere there was green. Mao's order that for every Chinese born a tree should be planted had taken fruit by the time our visit. Huge trees lined every street, turning the city into a beautiful and restful place. When we went south, we found orange blossoms out, jasmine trees smelling sweetly, and cassis flowers everywhere. The beauty of the country was only the first thing that surprised me. I found myself unsuspectingly riddled with Western prejudices about China, absurd notions that I had never thought to check, and only now saw for the first time in their full absurdity. I had assumed I needed vaccinations for every illness under the sun. Not so. China is virtually free of disease. I had simply accepted that it would be hideous. Not a bit of it. It was magnificent. I had images of a country of thin and sickly people. I found them all very healthy and caught up in a cult of physical fitness. When we went to the Great Wall, not only did Pierre and the Canadian delegation, but our entire party of Chinese hosts and journalists expressed concern about me, but I felt absurdly well. So when they tried to prevent me from climbing the wall, I turned to a journalist alongside me and said, "Race you to the top." I beat him. My most appropriate visit while in China was to Peking's one maternity hospital. It was a very comic occasion. I went surrounded by a great gang of journalists, and at the door we were enveloped in big white coats and sterilized masks and hats and slippers. There were lots of laughs and jokes. The first ward we visited contained an extremely sad-looking woman lying dejectedly on her bed. "Why is she so sad?" I asked the chief obstetrician. Through our interpreter, I learned that she had given birth the previous day by cesarean and that she had wanted natural childbirth. "Did she have acupuncture?" "Yes," came back through the interpreter. Simply to make conversation, having no doubts at all that the answer would be no, of course not, I asked whether the woman had felt any pain, and to my amazement, the patient perked up. "Yes," she replied in clearly resentful tones. "Indeed I did. It hurt very much indeed." So much for painless acupuncture. From the ward we went on to the case room, which, to my Canadian eyes, looked like a relic from one of our history museums. Forceps, a bucket, and a rickety old table. Mischievously, I asked the doctor where the mirrors were to let the women watch their babies being born. He looked shocked. "Oh, yes," I insisted. "You know mirrors where Mommy and Daddy—" "Daddy?" came a horrified cry. "Daddy in here?" Since I had myself had a blood problem with Justin, I asked my interpreter to find out what this hospital did with cases of Rh incompatibility. The doctor in charge looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The babies die, of course." It was my turn to be astonished. "They don't need to die. That's a disease of the past. There's an injection you can have within 2 hours of the birth of the first baby." And I described the inoculation that had been discovered in Winnipeg at the Rh Disease Center and what it had done for me. The Chinese doctors were very interested, and when I saw our Deputy Minister of Health that night at the hotel, he agreed to put the Winnipeg Center in touch with the Peking Hospital and get them to send vaccine and information. Even Pierre was impressed, and it was uphill work impressing Pierre. We traveled all over China. Pierre had been there a couple of times before, so we wanted to avoid the obvious cities like Shanghai and Canton. Our best trip, and certainly the most romantic, was to Kuai-lin, a 7-hour boat ride down the most beautiful river. The charming guide insisted on describing in detail every boat, factory, bird, and person we floated past. Pierre and I were in fits of giggles, and I thought that I would choke to death. These shared jokes, the way we could laugh with each other, were undoubtedly our best times. Kuai-lin is one of China's most famously beautiful spots, with remarkable caves of stalactites, which we explored for an entire afternoon, and tropical, totally deserted mountainous countryside. Sadly, it was here that we met with our first example of Chinese pollution. There's a soap factory at the foot of the mountain, and as we rounded the final bend in the river, Pierre and I saw smoke rings of dense gray clouds rising and settling over the top peak in the mountain range. It was clear that no one had given it a thought. "You've one of the finest sights in the world here," I said severely to Vice President Tang through our guide. "Why don't you move the factory up the river?" He looked surprised since we were some of the first Westerners to visit Kuilin, but he was also impressed. That day, Pierre and I made a private vow that has stayed with us ever since, to revisit China one day and make our way along its rivers and canals by boat, finishing up in the Yellow Sea. At one stop in China, we were met by a vast, enthusiastic crowd. To my Western eyes, they were all identical. I became convinced that the crowds plus costumes and bands were moving with us because wherever we were, they were. The same little girls doing the same dances in the same clothes with their faces painted, tassels in their hands, and little black shoes on their feet. And they always chanted the same song, a verse which, roughly translated, means, "Long live friendship between Canada and China." Unfortunately, it sounded exactly like "Goddamn whistle, Canada pecking." Once I had told Pierre neither of us could hear it any other way, so our paths were lined with little girls leaping into the air singing "Goddamn whistle, Canada pecking." For all our marvelous travels, I did miss one encounter I had much looked forward to, a meeting with Mao. By then, Mao was already weak. No appointments could be made to see him. It was simply a question of waiting and seizing the good moment. That moment came just at this time that I was visiting a kindergarten, so Pierre went alone. Later he described how impressed he had been by Mao, an old man who looked utterly frail, yet had a mind that was perfectly lucid. Instead of repeating questions, as other men of his age often did, Mao moved the conversation around the world one step at a time, never repeating anything and displaying a keen intellect, with provocative questions of policy and international relations, especially about the Middle East and Africa. Missing Chairman Mao was a terrible disappointment, but compensated for by a fascinating encounter with Premier Chou En-lai. The year we visited China, he was 76, a handsome, thin, elegant man with prominent cheekbones and warm brown eyes. I had had several unremarkable conversations with him in the course of our many receptions. Then came the day that we were due to leave Peking. Pierre and I had a free lunch to ourselves. Despite the series of delicious meals that we had eaten, we seemed to have missed out altogether on Peking duck. I asked our Chinese guide whether there was a restaurant in the city that we could visit to eat it. Then I thought no more about it. That morning we were in the great hall where Pierre and the premier were signing documents. When the formal ceremony was over and we were preparing to take our leave of him, took my hand and said with old-fashioned courtesy, "I have heard you want Peking duck. It will be my privilege to have a Peking duck lunch for you and your party." The feast was prepared as by a magic genie. No more than what seemed like a minute later, we were summoned back into the dining room. At the door, the Chinese policies started, Chinese fashion, sifting the men from the women so that all the women in the party were directed to sit at one side of one huge round table and the men at the other. Chou En-lai stopped him, and my translator told me what he had said. "Mrs. Trudeau doesn't like protocol of this kind. As it is her lunch, she is sitting next to me." What followed was undoubtedly the most curious and fascinating conversation in all my 5 years of official banquets. Our entire talk was conducted in English, despite the fact that Chou En-lai usually made it a point never to speak anything but Chinese in case his words were misinterpreted. He broke his rule for me, I think, because I was just Pierre's pregnant wife. We began by talking about my coming child. "I have very strong views about illegitimacy," the premier began. "I think it's a terrible thing for women to have to give up their babies or have abortions because they aren't married." He paused. "I've been thinking about this for some years, and I'll tell you why. Just after the revolution, a woman got on a train with her baby, and when she got off at the next station, she left her baby in a basket on the seat with a note that said, 'Please take this baby to Chou En-lai and let him bring up my beautiful boy. The social stigma against me having this baby because I'm not married is too great to bear.'" "Did you keep the baby?" I asked immediately. "What happened to him?" Chou En-lai replied, "My wife and I already had a family of our own, so we couldn't adopt him, but we put him with good people." "And have you followed his progress?" "Yes," he replied, smiling with obvious pride. "Indeed we have. He's turned into a fine boy." His next topic was even more unexpected. "I imagine you think Chinese women are liberated?" he asked me. "Well," I said cautiously, "they appear to be working side by side with the men. Economically, they seem to be liberated. They're a main part of the working force." "Ah," he said, "you're wrong. They're not liberated. You are liberated." I was astonished. "Me? I'm pregnant. I don't work. I'm a mother and I'm a housewife." "Yes," he said, "but the Chinese women are extremely embarrassed by their femininity, and you are not. Let me give you an example. I had what you call, and this gives me some idea of how excellent his English was, a girl Friday in my office. A girl who was really indispensable to me. I also liked her very much. Then one day she didn't appear. I assumed she was ill. After a week of embarrassed silence from everyone, it finally emerged that she had transferred jobs because she was pregnant. She had left word that she would return when this embarrassing state was over. She couldn't stand the thought of facing me in so humiliating a state. I was immediately conscious of my huge belly. I grabbed a napkin off the table and covered it, and Chou En-lai laughed. "Oh dear, no. You have come to terms with yourself as a woman. You are proud. To watch you walking as proud as a queen with your big belly is the happiest sight to see because you're so proud of it. Chinese women are still feudal in their attitudes toward their own femininity, their own bodies, their own sexuality. They have just become versions of men." I was so astonished by his words that I managed to swallow down the only course in the entire meal that I found repellent, snippets of the duck's intestines floating around in broth. In a true Peking duck dinner, you eat the whole bird. What an interesting conversation. And I think that honestly, there are parallels in America to the same thing he was seeing with a feminist movement that was looking to equalize men and women on complete terms. And what had happened was that the Chinese women were acting like Chinese men. And I think in America, we have a similar problem when it comes to the feminist movement here, because I think that American women, in their pursuit of total equality and what they think makes them equal to men, is that we have become a group that now tries to act like men rather than becoming even more feminine, rather than becoming more of what we are. We then try to copy a group. And I think what you end up seeing is like with the sexual revolution and all this, what we have is a group of women who have become extremely grotesque in their sexual expression. And we have women who are now vulgar and who feel like, I can just go out and if a man can go out and have sex with anyone, and I should be able to go out and have sex with anyone. And if a man's going to, run his mouth like this and talk, with a vulgar tongue in his head, I should be able to talk with vulgar tongue in my head. And we've lost the beauty and the delicacy of what it is to be a woman that makes us so appealing. And I think that in the same way that this man was saying, the Chinese women did not embrace their femininity. It was like an embarrassment to them, almost like a weakness, a humiliation. And I think that in America, we wouldn't hide a pregnancy and where our expression is, overly masculine in its vulgarity. We seem to be embarrassed by being dainty and sweet and thoughtful, and where we take pleasure in beauty and in protecting what is innocent and lovely. Women are, at the end of the day, some of the most powerful beings in the world. And not because we can act like a man, and not because we can go be a girl boss, and not because we can correctly imitate the vulgarities of a man, but because of the specific nature of our beauty. Because men do look at beautiful women and want them out of their own control. We have a power over men that they could never have. By acting like a man, we give up the very thing that makes us the most powerful. Our femininity is what makes us attractive. Our femininity is what makes us appealing. And so to cast that aside as like a lesser virtue, a lesser value, and to try to mimic like clowns a rough world that we think that we can dominate if we can just ride this bucking bronco, I think that we just end up becoming such lesser versions of ourselves. It doesn't mean that you have to be this sad little doormat that's just over there, doesn't have a word to say. Sure, you can have a word to say, but why give up being a woman along with it? I thought that was a very interesting conversation. Now, the chapter goes on, but we are going to save that for our next time because it's an extremely long chapter and I've already read for almost an hour, so I have to get on. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope that I see some of you this week as we finish up Megan's cooking show reviews. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.